I love this show. Wait a second, I've got a whole video essay to write. Cue the intro. Today we're here to talk about men. More specifically, One Piece men, and how I think they're written well. The world of One Piece is one that is driven by emotions, and undeniably the story does not ever reject human emotions. It also does not reject weakness or even brash and stupid decisions. In fact, all of these qualities are actually some of the most prominent traits in our main characters, making these traits something we are taught to embrace, even when traditionally, masculinity in shows often rejects these qualities, finding them unfit for a male audience. Ironically, the majority of the fans of the show, and even its primary target audience, is male. So having emotions be a core aspect of the story was never really detrimental to One Piece. There are, of course, characters that this theme of emotional vulnerability applies to more than others. For example, Zoro is a much more stoic character than, say, Luffy, but the general idea of exploring strong male characters without having to take away anything from them emotionally still applies. And within this, we have extreme diversity in our male characters. A man could be extremely masculine or be depicted as extremely feminine, and both can bawl their eyes out, break down, and be left completely helpless, making this take on masculinity something that could apply to every man. This continued theme of men bawling their eyes out like an episode of Steven Universe is not only a very healthy depiction of realistic people, but also a very useful tool to show that when a character experiences something tragic and doesn't cry, we as the audience understand that this isn't necessarily something to admire them for or see them as stoic for. Basically, the story tells us to root for these characters because of their emotions, not despite their emotions. And that can become a very powerful storytelling tool. Now, when I say masculinity in this video, I want to be clear to the story of One Piece, masculinity is quite simply something that can apply to any character who is a man. But how that character chooses to express such masculinity is unique and varied, and often doesn't completely take the form of something traditionally seen as masculine. But that does not mean that the character does not have masculinity, it just means they express it in their own way, whether that is pillaging and murdering or a bucket of tears. And this acceptance of different ways of showing masculinity has always been a part of One Piece, tying into the very prominent theme in the show of being an outcast, whether that means you have alternative views, undesirable features, or are just part of a group which is cast aside. This applies to One Piece's male characters in the sense that the ways they may express this masculinity may not always be the most normal, but are certainly validated and supported by the story. This can be seen with characters who are very emotional, like Frankie, or very cowardly, like Usopp, both having traditionally emasculating traits, but the story never treats that as making them less of a man. But beyond just those two, I think there are several male characters that stand out to me as very interesting cases of this, and I wanted to break them down, with their character arcs being great examples of how writing men, and more specifically male characters who influence a male audience, can be complex, emotional, and even highly varied in their depictions of what masculinity even is. To start with, I think the most obvious example of this is probably Luffy. Luffy has, from the beginning of the series to its current date, been a character with a very interesting way of showing himself, and, as an extension of that, masculinity. In fact, in his first scene in the manga, Luffy actually tries to prove a sense of being a man by stabbing his face. Which is obviously the stupid actions of a child, but I think they hold a certain level of importance in how they end up defining Luffy's idea of being a man. Now, Luffy is by no means traditionally masculine. He isn't stoic or even selfless, rather preferring to be very openly emotional, occasionally immature, and even selfish. In a sense, this builds his own way of being a man. But these acts of selfishness become positive and incredibly powerful when applied with his kindness, evening out his brash nature. In short, Luffy isn't traditionally masculine as a character. He often is childish and even cries on multiple occasions. Like, a lot. But he is definitely a character who depicts a positive use of one's own emotions, making him a character who is confident in his own sense of self and his ability to be whatever he wants. So if Luffy isn't really much of a masculine character, why do so many masculine men admire him as a protagonist? The simple answer is, male readers don't admire a character for simply being a buff fighter with a body of a pro wrestler. They instead are much more drawn to a character who, regardless of those things, is confident in themselves and can display traits that are respectable, such as kindness, determination, or knowing when to do the right thing. Despite the variation of One Piece's depictions of masculinity, this theme of having likable male characters display acts of either kindness or maturity is quite consistent, and tends to be what makes them admirable to male readers and viewers. So now that we've looked at a character who is liked despite not being traditionally masculine, let's look at a very different case, that being Roronoa Zoro. Or Zolo, if you read the manga. Zoro is, as far as the Straw Hats go, as manly as you can get. He uses pure power and strength to win a fight, he doesn't tend to get emotional about things, and is often seen playing the role of a big brother to characters like Chopper or Luffy. But I think people often forget that Zoro's appeal doesn't actually come from just his pure macho personality. If that were the case, his character's lack of depth would make him much less interesting and two-dimensional. I think Zoro's appeal actually comes from a very small part of him that occasionally shines through. That part being insecurity. This insecurity comes from his friendship with Kuna, who is always better at him in her ability to fight, making Zoro grow up forceful and desiring to always grow stronger, giving him just the slightest crack in his confidence. Most notably, this is seen in his first fight with Mihawk, when he loses, gets upset, and cries. Not only is this a very rare case of Zoro being vulnerable and upset, but it is also a classically emasculating scene. Zoro is easily defeated, humiliated, and then cries. The only thing is, it's not. The way the scene is written never depicts this defeat as something worth mocking or looking down upon Zoro for. And the audience isn't left feeling like Zoro is a failure of a man. The reason why is because Zoro never gives up. And the story depicts this very act of determination as a success. He may not be on the level of success as Mihawk, but he is certainly shown to be admirable for his pure determination, leaving us as the audience with respect for him, regardless of his insecurity. And that makes him appealing.